Thank you, Joe, for the invitation. You cannot get rid of us. We do keep coming back. And thanks to all the speakers over the last day and a half. I've had a great time. I've learned way too much, so much that I think I've forgotten my own talk. So we'll see how this works out today. I'm going to talk a little bit about metacognition, but I'm really going to discuss a very myopic, very specific aspect of metacognition, which is students' monitoring of their own learning. And a lot of the studies I'm going to show you today really focus on learning simple materials. I would say forgive me, but Scott set the stage, so we'll go simple, maybe a little bit more complex. Because I'm going to just focus on a very myopic, specific aspect of metacognition, I want to start with kind of a bird's eye view of what my research program has been about, and it's consistent with everyone else's. That for the last 25 years, I've really been trying to improve students' learning, retention, and comprehension. Now, as a director of the Science of Learning and Education Center at Kent State, the focus really is improving student achievement in the classroom. With that said, the research I'm going to describe today was all done in the laboratory, relatively simple materials, and so forth. Now, there are obviously many routes to accomplishing this goal, and we've already heard a lot of them. Throughout my career, I've been focusing just on self-regulated learning. And there are a variety of reasons for this, and it has to do with the perfect storm that hits students as they progress through an educational system. So from kindergarten all the way through grade school to high school and then on toward college, first thing that happens is there's just more to learn. Not only do they have literally more to learn, but the informational density of that material increases as well. More of this learning then naturally occurs outside of class as they progress on. I mean, typically in kindergarten, grade school, you're getting all your learning right in the classroom. But as you have more to learn, by necessity, the students are now responsible for learning this outside of the class. There's also less guidance for learning as you move on. Early grades, you're given worksheets, things to guide what you should be learning. College students are often, you have a lecture, you go outside, and it's your responsibility to guide your own learning. Unfortunately, when we ask students, where did you learn to basically study, they say, well, it's just something I picked up. Strangely enough, if you ask professors, where do students learn to study? They say, well, we teach them how to study. It's like, no, that really doesn't happen. I don't know where professors get this idea. There's also competing goals here that really concern us, because as you get more to learn, right, you're running into an efficiency problem. Students have to learn more efficiently because they just have more to learn, but also for the most critical content, they need to learn that in a way that it's durable. Now, not all of it per se, because we know we forget a lot of the content, but at least for some of it, you want to learn in a way that you can maintain that knowledge, say, to the next class, for the next year, and so forth. Okay? One very minor solution, a partial solution to this, has to do with self-regulated learning. And this is a promise, is that durability and efficiency of learning can be improved through the appropriate use of accurate monitoring. And my whole talk is going to focus on this accurate monitoring, the degree to which students can just assess their progress toward a learning goal. And the bottom line is, and hopefully this is just intuitive, students are really good at discriminating between what they know versus what they don't know, are going to be much more effective at guiding their own learning than students who have difficulties discriminating, right? Especially students who are overconfident, we know, are likely to prematurely stop studying before they know the content. There's lots of evidence to show this link between accurate monitoring and effective regulation. I'm going to just show you one piece of evidence that I find relatively striking. Relatively complicated figure for a relatively simple idea. For this, we had students use a flashcard program to learn concepts in class. And lots of the materials we deal with are declarative concepts. Our focus on these concepts is pretty straightforward. You open any introductory textbook in biology, chemistry, intro psych, and they're just filled with these fundamental concepts that students are supposed to understand and basically retain for their more advanced classes. So we want to help them with this. So for this study, we simply had students learn 8 declarative concepts from intro psych, like what are social norms, what's positive reinforcement, so forth. They would study each of these concepts, just like flashcards, and then we'd have them test themselves. So we'd say, well, what are social norms? And they'd type out their best definition. And at that point, we'd say, how good is your definition? How well do you understand this? And note, for all of these kinds of flashcard programs, we ask them, we don't want your verbatim recall of the content. Just recall it in your own words and try to get the gist or the meaning. Okay? So they judged the degree to which their particular recall captured the concept. I'm 100% accurate, I'm partially accurate, or wow, I really haven't learned this yet. Okay? So they then studied all the concepts again, tested themselves, and evaluated how well their basically recall was. And they kept doing this over and over again until they said they correctly recalled each one 3 times. Okay? So what I'm showing you here, these are actually bins of different students. And this is their actual score on the 3 correct practice trials. So for these students, when they said they were correctly recalling these definitions, in fact, they were doing really badly, right? Less than 50% of the time when they said they correctly recalled the gist or meaning of a definition, did they actually recall it. All the way over here, the students who have really good monitoring accuracy, when they say they're correctly recalling something, they actually are getting it. Okay? So we're going here from basically, this is most overconfidence to least overconfidence. Now, after this practice session, we had them come back several days later and gave them the test over these concepts, and this is basically percentage on this criterion test. And what we see is a really nice monotonic function with those students who are more overconfident during practice doing much more poorly, tremendously more poorly on the final test, whereas those students who are really accurate did well. Now the reason for this is very straightforward. I think it's almost trivial. It's because these students basically stopped studying before they learned the content. We analyze these students on all different dimensions. There are really no differences across them except this group of students were more overconfident. They spend just as much time studying the material. They did basically their recall protocols were just as long. They just didn't know when they were correctly recalling the gist or meaning versus incorrectly recalling. So this is a problem that we need to solve. The pitfall here is that students are often poor at monitoring their progress. Okay? And to help you understand this pitfall, I'm going to have to take a step back and talk a little bit about methodology that we use to evaluate students' quality of their monitoring. I'm going to first start with very simple materials, and then we'll move to complex. And after I give you the gist of the methodology, then I'll provide a couple prescriptions what we can do to help students more accurately monitor their progress while they're learning content. So here's a straightforward methodology using paired associates. We'd have students come into the lab, they study here foreign language vocabulary, cerveau brain, and then immediately after they basically predict how well they're going to do on the final test. They make a judgment of learning that varies from 0 to 100. 0 means I have not learned this item well at all, I'm not going to correctly recall it. 100% means, wow, I'm absolutely sure when you show me cerveau later on, I will correctly recall brain. So this judgment of learning is our measure, or our operationalization of monitoring. Okay? And they'd study another item, make another judgment, so on and so forth. And then as advertised, we'd give them a recall test, some objective measure of how well they learned that content. This is a hypothetical data from one participant, and relatively simple methodology that provides a rich data set for analysis. And there are typically 2 kinds of accuracy that we measure in these experiments. I'm going to describe them both now, and then I'm going to focus on one for most of the talk. The first kind is absolute accuracy, and it has to do with the degree to which the average judgment matches to the average level of performance. So if a student on average says, I'm going to get about 70% of these right, and they get 70% right, that's good absolute accuracy. Typically, however, we have students who will say, I'm going to get about 80% of this right. They get about 40% correct. That is, they're overconfident. Okay? Another measure of accuracy is relative accuracy, and this has been studied most often in the field. And that's the degree to which these judgments discriminate between what they'll correctly recall later on versus what they won't correctly recall. And of course, what we'd like to see is the judgments increase, the likelihood of recall to increase as well. Relative accuracy is often measured by simply correlating each student's judgments with their performance. Okay? Like any other correlation, run from -1 to 1. A 0 correlation means the students are horrible at discriminating between what they're learning versus what they aren't learning. We'd like to see everyone close to 1.0. This hypothetical student, 0.38, above 0, but certainly far from perfect. About 5 years ago, Rosenthaler published a meta-analysis of the literature looking at just a student's ability to monitor their learning of these simple associations. And their estimate across all these studies is a mean correlation of 0.42. Right? That is, yeah, typically students have above chance accuracy, but they're well below perfect, this 1.0. They don't discriminate well between what they've learned well versus what they haven't learned well. Now, the same methodology has been used also to investigate students' meta-comprehension, or their ability to monitor how well they're learning contents from text material. And the methodology, again, is very similar. In a standard meta-comprehension study, you'd have people study 6 to 12 texts, and each of these texts would be 200, 400 words long. This is a favorite of one of mine. Yeah? Do you have the question? Okay, that's okay. This is a favorite one of mine. It just comes from a methodology textbook on measurement. And then after they'd study the text, they'd make a judgment of learning, or what's called a meta-comprehension judgment. So how well will you perform on an upcoming test of the information within the text? Pretty straightforward. Subsequently, again, a test is administered, usually several questions per text, so we could evaluate the accuracy of the judgments. Again, a hypothetical data set here. They studied lots of text. These are the judgments. And here's the performance across all of those texts. And again, relative accuracy is just the correlation between these judgments for each subject and performance. The first study conducted in this area was in the early 1980s by Art Glenberg. For some reason, research in the area didn't catch on, and Ruth Mackey, on her own, basically was saving the day, doing lots of research up in North Dakota State. We asked her to write a meta-analysis, or to analyze the field in a chapter for us, and basically her analysis was on all our own studies, because she was the only one doing this work. And she said, averaging across 25 studies conducted in our lab, the mean correlation for predictions was 0.27. That's pretty low, which may mean, it definitely means, that students cannot predict performance well. And this part I loved, and that prediction is not a teachable skill. Right? Ruth is very pessimistic at this point that students can do this well, and I loved it because she's like throwing the gauntlet down. That one phrase led a lot of us to start investigating this, because I thought, well, Ruth, who I love and adore, she must be doing something wrong, because we can get students to do this a lot better. And I wasn't the only one thinking that way, because in that next 10 years after her review chapter, it became a cottage industry. Everyone was trying to find ways to improve students' meta-comprehension. About 11 years later, Keith Teedy published another review of all the research done since Ruth's study. And this is what Teedy had to say. Interestingly, an average of the standard predictive accuracy condition also leads to an average correlation of 0.27. So even though we thought we could do what what Ruth could not do, in fact, still accuracy here generally is really low. Okay? So those are some examples of how students are often poor at monitoring their learning of both simple materials and a little bit more complex materials. Okay. The good news is that monitoring accuracy can be improved, and for about the next 20 minutes, I'm going to just talk about some prescriptions on improving students' relative accuracy of monitoring both paired associates and text materials. The bad news is, and it'll be the last study I show, the prescriptions I'm going to offer today are not going to be a panacea for helping students in all contexts. We have a lot of research to do to understand how to support quality monitoring of educational content. Okay. The first prescription is that students need to simulate the target task. This is not going to be a surprise. And here I mean simulation. Typically, if a student is trying to learn chemistry for an upcoming comprehension test where they have to use that knowledge, then they should be basically taking self-test to evaluate how well they're learning this context. So they're simulating what they want to do in the future. Something, by the way, that any student would do outside of academia. If they're getting ready for a recital, if they're getting ready for a dance, right? You practice, you simulate, you evaluate, and you move on. Works really well. And this simulation will often require retrieval from long-term memory, because basically the tests that we give students are typically not open book tests, right? They have to retrieve this content from memory. So even though they might be able to look things up on Google outside of the classroom, typically when we're testing them, we hope they have really good access to the content and can use it. So simple prescriptions, what does this mean in the context of at least paired associate learning? What I have here, what I showed you earlier, is what's called an immediate judgment of learning, that it occurs immediately after you study the paired associate. Okay? This is a simulation, but it doesn't involve retrieval from long-term memory. Basically, in this context, you see cerveau, well, brain is typically just readily activated in memory, hence you can't evaluate how well it's been stored and will be retained for a longer period of time. Well, a simple way to sidestep this problem with associations is merely delay the judgment, right? So now you would study cerveau brain, study quite a few others for a minute or so, and then come back to this and make what we call the delayed judgment of learning. I think this is pretty straightforward. Note that this particular delayed judgment is cued by the stimulus alone so that you can basically simulate your target task, which is a cued recall task. Another way to make this delayed judgment is giving them both the stimulus and response. Okay? Now note, this really doesn't involve retrieval from long-term memory. There's some technically it does, but let's sidestep that. It's more of a familiarity response. How familiar are you with these two items? That response is from long-term memory, but we'll sidestep the details from right now. Okay? So the prediction here is that delayed JOLs prompted by only the stimulus of a pair should yield the best accuracy. And to test this, did basic delayed versus immediate JOLs, and then we had some of the judgments prompted by just the stimulus, cerveau, and some of the judgments prompted by the stimulus response. Okay? And here are the data. Again, these are means across individual correlations for the different groups. This is the stimulus response prompt, either immediate or delayed judgments. Again, the accuracy is about the middle of the scale. Plenty of room for improvement here. Immediate JOLs prompted by the stimulus alone here, but what about these delayed JOLs prompted by the stimulus alone? Here we see incredibly good levels of accuracy. The reason for this is straightforward. If you could recall it, the delayed JOL, you think you will recall it later on. If you can't recall it at that time, you won't be able to recall it later on. Turns out absolute accuracy for this group was incredibly good as well compared to the others. Okay? Turns out, and this is giving away some of the punchline, all you need to do is impose errors, right? So now they're coming up with some incorrect answers, and accuracy here plummets, right? And I'll get back to that soon. Let's think about this in the context of learning text materials. This is research that I did with Mariette van Loon and some friends in the Netherlands. Mariette was working on her dissertation, and she wanted to help students monitor their learning of cause-effect relations in a science text. And this is a text on Botox, which just discusses what Botox does, and there's a variety of cause-effect relationships in here. Mariette's idea was we potentially could help students evaluate how they're learning these cause-effect relationships by having them complete these diagrams, where they would start with Botox blocks the signal between the muscle and skin, and the students had to basically just jot out the simple cause-effect relationships that occurred after there. Okay? In her study, she had either immediate versus delayed diagram completion, and no surprise, and here the comprehension questions were basically asking students about the cause-effect relations in these different science texts. So for Botox, it would be Botox blocks the signal between nerves in the skin. What are the effects of this? And the students would have to write out their answer. Here the prediction is simply the delayed diagram completion should produce higher levels of accuracy. So this is the causal relation test. This is relative accuracy. Again, this is weird. It's around 0.27, okay, in the context where they had the immediate diagram completion. When you have delayed diagram completion, we see a significant and quite substantial increase in relative accuracy. Now, one thing to note here is still there's plenty of room for improvement. On the other hand, at least within the meta-comprehension literature, this is a sizable level of relative accuracy. So we're making some inroads as well. And if you'd like to ask questions about this, I'm almost sure I know why this is not on the ceiling. Okay? She also had a fact test, literally asking them about specific facts in each of these texts that students read. Here, note that the diagram completion isn't targeting that particular text, so we wouldn't necessarily expect to see good levels of accuracy for the judgments for predicting the facts. And that was the case in this particular experiment. What I would have loved to have seen is some kind of completion test where they would have had to recall the facts, right? And then predict their memory for those facts, and my guess is we'd see the shift. Now you'd get better relative accuracy for the facts and less for completion. We just didn't have that particular group. Okay. So accuracy can be improved using self-tests that simulate the target task. I think it seems relatively straightforward. I know most students think that is relatively straightforward because when they do say they're using tests to get ready for their exams, they almost always endorse they're using them to evaluate their knowledge. They don't realize that tests can have an added benefit of helping them improve their knowledge. So students do get it. The difficulty is that it won't always help them and can hurt them and can lead to overconfidence. And that's going to be a big part of this last part of my talk. Okay? So students are going to need our help. To understand the difficulty, what I'm going to do is walk you through a simple theoretical framework that explains, or at least describes, where accuracy comes from. This framework was simple, completely stolen from Egon Brunswick. This is his lens model. For Egon, though, he was interested in things like how people made judgments, perceptual judgments, like the size of different objects or the distance of objects. And his incredible insight is that our system isn't built to just tell us how big things are, how far away they are, but we pick up on a variety of cues in the environment to guess or make our best guesstimate about size and distance and so forth. The same is true with metacognition. We do not have direct access to how well we comprehend or how well we can retain content. What we're doing is trying to make guesses about how well we've learned information based on a variety of cues in the environment. So let me walk through this. So here, judgment accuracy is literally the relationship between judgment and target performance. Cue diagnosticity is the degree to which the cues in your internal and external environment predict target performance. Okay? And cue utilization is the degree to which the judge utilizes those cues to make their judgment. We think that a simulation is influencing the kinds of cues that are available for students to assess their own knowledge, right? And a good simulation should increase the diagnosticity of those cues, right? They should be more predictive. So in the case of a paired associate learning, it's pretty straightforward. You have a delayed JOL, and now your cues are almost perfectly predictive of how well you're going to do in the future. Good simulations produce high cue diagnosticity. Unfortunately, and this is the killer for students, they do not guarantee appropriate utilization. So I can have lots of cues in my internal in here that are going to tell me how well I'm going to do on the test. But if I don't interpret those cues appropriately, I could be led to having overconfidence or an inaccurate judgment. Okay. So what I'm going to do, if that wasn't clear, I'm going to make it very obvious using an example from some of the research that I conducted with Catherine Rawson and Erica Middleton. And we had students study 6 expository texts, and each of these had 4 key terms in them. And again, this is an example from a measurement textbook, and we have nominal measurement as a key term, ordinal measurement, so forth. We had them make delayed judgments. How confident are you that you will remember the definition of the term nominal measurement? Okay, so they studied this text, studied several others, and then we just have them predict how well they'll retain this content. Very straightforward. So after they read the text, as I mentioned, they made a delayed judgment for each of these key terms within each text. And the criterion test was cued recall. Okay. So we just asked them, well, now tell us, what is the definition of nominal measurement? Note that the simulation is identical to the criterion test. Okay. We expect what they're coming up with to make the judgment is going to be highly predictive of how well they'll perform on this test. Okay. Now, we weren't completely convinced that that would be the case, so we had 2 groups. One we call a no forced recall group. They did not have to try to recall the definition prior to making the judgment. So we just said, predict how well you're going to do. Another group, though, we forced them. So before they made their judgments, like, please do your best to recall the definition of nominal judgment and then predict how well you're going to do. There are 2 reasons we did this. First, it's kind of pessimistic, but we all know students and we all know ourselves. Sometimes we get cognitively lazy, right? You say, well, we think the best way to make this judgment is really to go through a full-blown retrieval attempt, but I just studied that passage and I see nominal measurement. I think, yeah, I know what that is. I'm familiar with it. I just saw it, right? So this group, we are really since we're forcing them to recall the definition, it ensures that the appropriate simulation is going on. It's also going to allow us, and this is critical, to estimate Q diagnosticity and Q utilization. Okay. So this is the relative accuracy for the group with a no forced recall. Again, near the middle of the scale, but well below perfect. Okay. With a forced recall, we thought that would be a lot higher, by the way. This is a significant effect. If I had the error bars on there, they'd be little small guys. Okay, sorry about that. So it's a significant effect, suggesting that some students were lazy, but by no means did this lead to the extremely high levels of accuracy that we were expecting, really expecting. This was one of many disappointing outcomes in my career because we didn't understand what in the world was going on. Okay? But what I'm going to do now is break down this value into its different components. So this is not a path analysis. This is simply 0.64 represents that mean correlation across individuals. Okay. Now for the forced recall group, we could go in and score their recall and evaluate the quality of their recall and correlate that for each subject with a target performance. And just as we expected, this correlation is extremely high. The cues that are available for the student are highly predictive of their target performance. We could also then look at the relationship between these cues and their judgments. And this is the limiting factor, right? They are not appropriately using the cues available to them to judge how well they're going to do in the future. So what in the world is going on here? Okay. This is one of the concepts we use. What is narcolepsy? And it's a disorder in which an individual has necessary but unpredictable sleepiness during the day. This is an actual subject's response. That's wrong, right? This student gave themselves full credit for this response. They said, yeah, I know what it is. It's a disorder when you have an easy time. Yeah, I'm going to do really well on the test. Okay? That's problematic. Okay? And the difficulty here is that students have a hard time evaluating the quality of commission errors. If it comes to mind, you think it's correct. Okay? The unfortunate thing is we're finding when students are learning relatively complex materials, they often don't have omission errors. I mean, students know if they can't come up with anything, I may not have it. But on their way to mastery, what they do a lot of is come up with these commission errors. They're not quite there yet. They've got something that resembles the correct answer, but is completely incorrect. Okay. So how do we help students out? What I'm going to do is show you data where we are attempting to develop a variety of scaffolds that would help students better evaluate the quality of their errors as they're working toward mastery. A problem we needed to solve because we're using some of these flashcard programs where students are trying to say, recall the definition of biology concepts. They're coming up with commission errors and they don't realize it. Okay? We need to help them sidestep that. So in this particular experiment, we had a delayed forced recall group where they recalled definition prior to making the judgment. We also used a delayed judgment for all of these, but instead of having them predict their future performance, now we're just having them grade the quality of what they're recalling. How good is this definition? Does it capture the essence or the meaning of that particular concept? So we basically took out the prediction part of this because we didn't want to know whether they're going to forget it and all this other kind of thing. We made the task easier for them. Importantly, when making the judgment, the correct definition was there. So this student not only would see the correct answer, they would see their actual answer, and we'd say, okay, please tell us how much credit you'd get for this. When we first did this study, we realized, come on, this is trivial. Of course, students are going to be perfect now. All you have to do is give them feedback, and it'll completely eradicate their overconfidence. And here's what we found. These are data from 2 separate experiments. Note, now I'm shifting away from relative accuracy and just going to talk about absolute accuracy. These data are for just the commission errors only, and these data sets, by far, commission errors are the most dominant. About, 60 to 70% of students' responses are commission errors, at least. Okay. Note that any judgment above 0 is overconfident. Perfect accuracy is saying for all of these items, I shouldn't receive any credit. I just don't get it yet. I need to study again. Okay? Even with the correct definition right in front of them, we still see significant overconfidence. Across these experiments, 15 to 30% of the time, with the correct definition right in front of them, they're saying they deserve full credit for a commission error. That's really extreme overconfidence, okay? And it's extremely unfortunate as well. Okay? So students have difficulties identifying commission errors, and my heart goes out to them, because this is not an easy task, right? Many of the concepts we're using are relatively lengthy. They have lots of idea units in them. Their responses, commission errors, are quite creative and often have many of the similar words in them as the correct definition. And to do this well, you'd have to basically break down the correct definition into its key components, do the same thing kind of for your answer, match it up to decide, do I have all the correct components? So we had the insight that maybe we could develop a better scaffold to help them evaluate the quality of what they're recalling. And we call this scaffold an idea unit feedback. And all we did was go in, and for each of these definitions, we just broke it up into what we thought the key idea units are. We didn't use an algorithm. I think I was drinking a beer with these definitions and just putting slashes where I thought it made sense. So what a student would do, they recall their answer the best they could, and then we would represent their answer along with the idea units, and we'd have them look at each idea unit and compare to their answer and just make a check of whether that idea was represented in their answer. After they did that, then they'd simply rate the quality of their response. Do they get full credit, partial credit, or no credit? Okay. Now these data are from the experiment 2. I've already shown you this value with overconfidence when they get the definition feedback. Okay. This idea unit judgments helped, or the idea unit feedback helped tremendously. Now only about 3% of the time do students say they deserve full credit when they're coming up with a commission error. Now the difficulty here, I love this technology, but teachers aren't going to spend the time to come up with all these idea units for every kind of definition concept students would learn. So I had a graduate student at the time, Marissa Hartwig, who wanted to know, well, maybe students can do this on their own. So for this group of subjects, we gave them basically a sheet with all the definitions, and we asked them first, would you please go through and just mark all the idea units yourself? Their idea units were not at all like ours, okay? And they really weren't all alike each other's. Every student had their own idea about what the idea. Now, 1 or 2 students said the word "the" was an idea unit, making me think that maybe they didn't know what ideas are. Although, is "the" an idea? I'll talk to the English folks in the room. Nevertheless, doing this on their own greatly reduced overconfidence. Okay. So this technique, at least I think, shows some promise for helping students evaluate the quality of their recall of these foundational concepts in courses. Okay. And we've replicated this multiple times. It's the basis of an auto-tutor that we have that's led to better class performance, very similar to some of the research that Catherine was presenting. So we're really happy that we're making big strides. Okay. So idea unit feedback can be effective, but it's going to be extremely limited. Now I was kind of a little optimistic, now I'm going to go extremely pessimistic again. And let me show you some relatively new data. We had participants studying these same declarative concepts, and for each of these concepts at a delay, we had them generate an example of the concept. Well, why do we do that? Catherine Rawson has been doing research for the last 4 or 5 years trying to understand how examples can help students understand the meaning of declarative concepts. Not only how the examples can help, but can students generate examples, and does that help them learn the content? In a way, the goal of learning these foundational concepts is that students can apply them outside of the classroom. That is, that they can generate, right, real-world examples. Probably no surprise to you all, students struggle generating examples of these concepts, even in an open book format, and even when they've already read multiple examples. So our question is, well, can we help students at least know when they're generating a bad example? That is, can we help them monitor the quality of their example generation? Because if they can detect where they're struggling, by God, then potentially they can correct it, either by getting help, going back and reading the text, and so forth. So for each concept, they generated this example, and we had them make a judgment of the quality. If the quality of your example was being graded, do you think you would receive no credit, partial credit, or full credit? Very straightforward. We also had 3 feedback groups. A group that received no feedback, we thought they would be horrible, right? Highly overconfident. A group that received the full definition, so they got not an example, but they got the definition and their example and evaluated. And the idea unit feedback, where so for social norm, they'd get the definition here, they would get their example. Again, they would have to say whether each idea is represented in their example, and then they judge the quality. All right. This is what we found. First, note that perfect accuracy is here. Anything above that is overconfidence. I would suggest that that represents a high level of overconfidence. They're generated, because these are all commission errors. All of these examples that go into these analyses are completely incorrect, okay? With nothing to compare their response to, they're really highly overconfident. No surprise. So we thought, well, the full definition probably won't be great, but it's going to help them a lot. Yeah, not really, okay? So that's all right. The full definition feedback has failed in the past, but certainly the idea unit feedback is going to help. That's significantly worse. Giving them those ideas from the definition is actually making them think that these commission errors, these examples that they're generating, are better than they actually are. Okay? We've replicated this now a couple times. And currently, Amanda Zamri, one of Catherine's student who's on this project, is developing training protocol to help students better evaluate the quality of their examples. And we hope we can find different techniques that are going to help them judge their learning of this particular important skill, right? Applying your knowledge in real-world domains. Okay, a couple conclusions. First, students are often poor at judging their learning. We've known that for decades. Not only students, by the way, everybody in this room in context would have difficulties. It's just not an easy task. Simulating target performance can improve accuracy, at least in some context. The difficulty is if you don't have an appropriate feedback, students and everyone is going to have a difficult time evaluating the quality of their errors. And that's unfortunate, right? Because what we want students to be able to do is to evaluate and detect when they're struggling, when they're having problems. We know students will need help constructing appropriate feedback to evaluate their knowledge. The idea unit feedback can help them when it just comes to standard recall and understanding of concepts, but it's not a panacea. And what I want to, even though this is somewhat pessimistic, what I want to leave you with is one major conclusion. We've all taught classes where students come into our office after they failed an exam and they're said, geez, I was sure I knew all this content, but yet I'm doing poorly. When I was younger, I thought, wow, this student is really loopy. They're just really dicking with me. Anymore, I'm highly compassionate. I really do believe that student felt they knew the content, that how they studied and how they evaluated themselves led them to extreme overconfidence. So what we need to do is figure out, as a research community, ways to help students better evaluate their learning in real-world context. And I think we've made some inroads in the last 25 years, but I know we have quite a ways to go. So I want to thank all of my collaborators here on this research, some supports. I want there to be another line in there next year. I'm looking for a postdoc student for any of you who are about to graduate and looking for a little extra work in research and cognitive education. Please do send me an email. So thank you, and I'll take any questions.